Okay, so the course is entitled, as you already know, the Gospel of Matthew in its first century Jewish context. The reason that's so important is because so many people read the New Testament, read the Gospels without an awareness of the Jewish context, and they end up with all kinds of interpretations. So we want to try to override that difficulty. All right, so let's begin. Now, when you think of the Gospel of Matthew, people think of all kinds of crazy things when they think of what Matthew looked like. Well, we certainly don't know what Matthew looked like or what anybody necessarily looked like. So when I think about the Gospel, what I want you to remember, or what I remember is that I think about this. Does anybody recognize where this shot is? Obviously on the Sea of Galilee, but do you recognize that spot? So when you think about the Gospel of Matthew, I want you to visualize this above anything else, because by the end of this course, what we'll find out is that the Galilee is at the very heart of Matthew's Gospel. And so by the end of this mini course, we'll have unpacked all of that. All right, so before we actually dive into the gospel itself, what we're going to talk about is really one of the problems when it comes to interpreting Matthew's gospel, or in fact, the whole Old Testament, and that's the issue of supersessionism. And if you're unfamiliar with that term, some people refer to it as supersessionism, some people refer to it as replacement theology. There are a couple different names, but the point of it is it's the view that the church has replaced Israel as the new people of God. And so it's this huge problem when it comes to reading the New Testament. And there, unfortunately, are a lot of these people out there who have this approach to reading the text. So if you're joining us, please mute yourself so that we don't carry on across the whole screen. Thanks. All right, so I want to give some examples of some of these individuals, some of these biblical scholars who share this view, who are supersessionists. So here are a couple quotes from some of these individuals. By far, one of the most famous persons is N.T. Wright, who is a world-renowned New Testament scholar. Unfortunately, when it comes to Israel, he's very wrong. He writes, "The promises to Jerusalem, to Zion, are now transferred to Jesus and his people." What he means by that is that they've been transferred from Israel to the church, and that Israel, the nation, the Jewish people, have been put on the outside of God's program. Jewish people can become a Christian and become part of the kingdom, but in terms of any covenant standing, that has been removed. He writes elsewhere in another book, the church has, quote, taken the place occupied by Jewish ethnic identity. So that alone would make me stop in my tracks, but it gets even more problematic. Gary Burge, another New Testament scholar, writes regarding Matthew 21, verses 3 through 44, the new tenants, the new occupants will gain the vineyard, meaning the land of Israel. New residents will come to the land of Israel. So that's just two examples of two theologians, but it keeps going. Burge goes on, Jesus is surprisingly silent with regard to the territorial aspirations and politics of his day. So there's really two things here. One is saying that God has taken what there is from Israel, the land that was once Israel, has taken that position away of being the covenant nation, and that if there was anything in the New Testament all about the land, he has taken that from them, or it doesn't mention it all in the gospel. So there's nothing in the gospel, and if there was something in there about it, it's not very significant. But going on, Stephen Sizer, who's another New Testament scholar, writes, the New Testament knows nothing of this preoccupation with an earthly kingdom. And then he adds also, it is therefore no longer appropriate for Christians to designate the Jewish people as God's chosen people, since the term has now been universalized to embrace all who trust in Jesus Christ, irrespective of race. Now that sounds good and universal, but it's really a very negative statement when it comes to the Jewish people and the nation of Israel. He goes on, more conclusive, however, are the categorical statements made by Jesus in which he rules out any notion that Israel would enjoy a divinely mandated national identity as kingdom in the future. Therefore, again, quoting Matthew 21:43, therefore the kingdom of God will be taken from you and given to a people who produce its fruit, meaning the church. So you sort of have this unholy trinity of New Testament scholars who say that one, Israel has been removed from its covenant position, and secondly, whatever there is in the gospel about the land isn't significant and it's unimportant about Israel's covenant inheritance. And another scholar, finally, Colin Chapman, writes, Jesus had very little to say specifically about the land. So, and it goes on and on and on, and we could talk about all kinds of scholars who share this position. Unfortunately, this academic view of Israel has a trickle-down effect, and it may start in the ivory tower, but it trickles down and makes its way into the pew and into the Sunday school class, and then you end up with all kinds of negative views about Israel and the Jewish people. And of course, if you've been paying attention to the news, you know a lot of that's unfolding in the world right now. The war that's taking place between Hamas and Israel isn't just limited to Israel. It is, in terms of discussion and heated discussion in the media and on the streets, it is out of control. And we've seen an outburst of anti-Semitism that we have not seen in a very, very long time. So it is a huge problem when it comes to interpreting the New Testament, how we can get past that problem of reading the Bible with this grid of supersessionism, of replacement theology. So, which sort of begs the question, what do we mean exactly by supersessionism? Now, Joel Willis, who's a great biblical scholar, New Testament scholar, Matthew scholar, writes the following. He says, supersessionism refers to any interpretation of the New Testament that intentionally or unintentionally would lead to the eventual disappearance of the Jewish ethnos, of the Jewish nation, the Jewish people, from the ecclesia, the congregation of Yeshua, the Messiah. And that pretty much sums it up. But more specifically, as I said, supersessionism is simply this idea that Israel has been replaced or superseded by the Gentile church. And this theology dominates Christianity. Well, so it's a challenge to interpret the New Testament with that reality in mind. Now, how many of you are familiar with this book called The God of Israel and Christian Theology? Anybody read this, or are you familiar with it?
Familiar with Solon, but not his book specifically.
Okay, well, this is a really important book by Solon called The God of Israel and Christian Theology. And in it, he really set the bar when it came to this discussion about supersessionism. And he identified 3 types of supersessionism, as if that wasn't enough, that there's one. And it's important that we understand what they are. It's punitive supersessionism, economic supersessionism, and finally what he calls structural supersessionism. Now, these quotes are actually from written by another scholar named Craig Blazing, but it's a good summary of the book, so I included it. But Blazing writes, punitive supersessionism on the first level maintains that God has rejected the Jews because of their rejection of the Messiah. The catastrophes of AD 70 and AD 135 were the political expressions of a fundamental divine abandonment of Israel in punishment for her rejection of the Messiah. As a result, God has turned his back on the Jews and has embraced the Gentile church in their place. Goes on. Jews who reject the Messiah Jews who reject Jesus as the Jewish Messiah are therefore consequently condemned by God, forfeiting promises otherwise due to them under the covenants. So this first form of supersessionism is all about punishment. Now, this is a little out of fashion today, or at least it has been for many centuries, not many centuries, in fact, many years after the Holocaust, because of the terrible atrocities inflicted on the Jewish people. It became very unpopular to go around espousing these things. But these are the kind of things that we read about in Martin Luther and some of these very early patristic fathers, that God punished Israel for rejecting Jesus and stripped them of their covenant position. Now, again, after the Holocaust, this became very unpopular, but it's making a comeback, I think. The second view is called economic supersessionism. And this view argues that the entire economy or dispensation, meaning a way that God runs things, the entire dispensation of Israel from Sinai to the Messiah was designed by God as a transitory symbol or a type of an eternal spiritual religion to be revealed by Messiah and embodied in Christianity. The nationalist, ethnic, physical defining features of Judaism are all, like the entire story of Israel, only a carnal symbol, divinely intended to pass away when God brought the eternal spiritual antitype, the church, into being. In other words, what this view means is it's nothing personal, but Israel as a theological idea is no longer functioning and has been replaced by something better. So out with Israel, in with the church is the idea. But it's it doesn't sound as violent as punitive supersessionism, but it's even more significant in a way, because it says the system itself has been done away with. Now, again, it gets worse. We go from economic supersessionism to what Solon calls structural supersessionism. And by far, this is the most significant or serious form of supersessionism. Let me see. Okay, sorry. Structural supersessionism, as I said, is
Can't read that.
the most serious. In structural supersessionism, scripture is habitually read with distinctly Jewish or Israelitish elements of scripture, a mere background to the biblical story that moves primarily from universal creation to universal consummation by way of universal sin and universal redemption. Israel per se is not really even the main story of the Bible. So, in other words, Israel and the Jewish people can actually be left out of the whole thing. And this, believe it or not, is the most serious form of supersessionism. Let me show you what I mean. To do that, let's talk about the story of the Bible. Now, what do I mean by that? I mean by the story of the Bible, this grand overarching story that puts all the pieces together. So again, let me remind you, if you're new to the discussion, please mic yourself so that we don't pick up or no, please mute yourself, sorry, so that we don't pick you up on the microphone. So the story of the Bible, or the standard canonical narrative, is this big overarching story that pulls all the pieces together. Now, typically, that narrative is what? So if I asked you to sum up the story of the Bible, of course, I've given it to you in the notes, so you already know what it was, but I bet you most of you could have already answered this even without me giving it to you in the notes. And what is the big story of the Bible, the big talking points? It's usually 4 plot points, namely creation, Genesis 1 and 2, the fall, Genesis 3, redemption, Genesis 3:15, of course, the proto-evangelium. You will bite his heel, God says to the serpent, but he will crush your head. And then, of course, universal restoration at the end of the story, Revelation 21 through 22. But look what happened. We went from creation, we went from the Garden of Eden, chapter 1 and 2, chapter 3, the fall, and then we go to the end of the Bible. So what is missing from that story? Obviously, what's missing from that story is, well, the whole Hebrew Bible, the whole story of Israel and the Jewish people. All that has been pushed to the background. Not only pushed to the background, you just don't even see it. It's not there. And unfortunately, this is the way many people read the Bible. So let me see. Oops, sorry. Okay, so again, if you're with us and your mic is not muted, please mute that for me. All right, so, but it's kind of like this. Does anybody recognize what this is from?
West Side Story.
Correct.
Yeah.
West Side Story. Very good. Now I have to tell you a story about this. When I was like a teenager, not even a teenager, I mean really young. I was living in Canada. There's a plug ever for you Canadians. The first time West Side Story was on TV, we were all excited, and my gang of high school kids got together to watch West Side Story. And we thought it was about a bunch of gangs that were going to fight. And so what happens? All these guys break out and doing ballet. Well, all the guys were traumatized, got up and left in disgust. And of course, all the girls sat and watched the rest of the TV show. But what is West Side Story really about? Anybody know?
It's about prejudice.
It is, but what is it a retelling of?
Romeo and Juliet.
Romeo and Juliet.
Correct. That's the clue. Romeo and Juliet. Did anybody not know that? It's the first time you've learned that? It's pretty fascinating. But West Side Story is really a retelling of the story of Romeo and Juliet, except what's happened. It's been set in a modern context in New York City, and the names, the places have been changed. Well, that's sort of what happens when people use this meta-narrative or this canonical narrative where they remove Israel from the storyline. The idea is that history is not really that important. What's important is we get the big picture, the grand narrative. And so the assumption is, well, you can tell any story in the background. It can be a Western, it can be anything. But the question is, can you really do that when you read the Bible? Is the history really not important? Well, a long time ago in church history, Christianity decided that it rejected Gnosticism, the idea that matter is evil and the spirit is good. It rejected theological Gnosticism, but it embraced historical Gnosticism, meaning it said that history really is not that important, the details. The story in the Bible, the people, the land, all of that can be changed for another story. Unfortunately, that is exactly what's happened. And that is why Israel is pushed to the back of the picture. All right, so I would suggest that that's
I
not.
want to do what is lecture for this lecture? Send it to you. We don't have Zoom.
Mute yourself, please. Thanks. So instead, what I would suggest, a better way to read the Bible is that to do it through a larger story of two big ideas. One, covenant, because that's what the Hebrew Bible is all about, God's covenants with Israel, from the Abrahamic covenant, or of course, it begins with the Noahic covenant, but it quickly moves to the Abrahamic covenant and leads us all the way to the new covenant and everything in between. And that involves the Hebrew Bible. And then in the New Testament, the kingdom, the story of how God brings those covenants to their ultimate fulfillment in the kingdom, the second or the new covenant, or the second covenant, as I prefer to call it. And this, I think, provides a better way of reading the story. And so you have the covenant unfolding, the need for the covenant. You do have the fall in there, you cannot deny it. But then you have the story of Israel, which involves the patriarchs, and then the story of slavery and redemption, and then entering the land under Joshua and Judges, and then the kingdom in the book of First Samuel and Kings, and then the exile and return. All of that is left out under the traditional way of telling the story of the Bible. Of course, then you have this period of silence for 400 years, but it was really anything but silent. There was all kinds of theology taking place during that time. And then you reach the New Testament, where you have the story of the kingdom, where the kingdom is inaugurated, and Jesus calls the remnant of Israel, and the kingdom is spread in the book of Acts. And then you have it pass from Jerusalem to Rome, and then from Rome to the ends of the earth. And then finally, you get to the book of Revelation, and you have the return of the king and the restoration of Israel, the new Jerusalem and the new heavens and the new earth. That's really the story of the Bible. So the option of just sort of summing it up in creation, fall, and redemption, and leaving Israel out of the story is not the way to read the Bible, at least not the way to read it properly. So this brings us to what we call post-supersessionism. There's been a growing movement of scholars who recognize that you can't read the Bible like that you need to keep Israel in the story. And all this is sort of preamble to getting to the Gospel of Matthew, I promise. And so the Society of Post-Supersessionism defines it like this: a family of theological perspectives that affirms God's irrevocable covenant with the Jewish people as a central and coherent part of ecclesial teaching. It seeks to overcome understandings of the new covenant that entail the abrogation or obsolescence of God's covenant with Israel, the Jewish people, of the Torah as a demarcator of Jewish communal identity or of the Jewish people themselves. In other words, it's a very fancy way of saying it rejects this idea of writing Israel and the Jewish people out of the story. Now, Joel Wiltz, in another essay, points out that when you read the Bible, you always bring with it your assumptions. And so if you reject this idea of replacement theology, what assumptions do you need to have? Well, for one, you need to have the view that God's covenant with the Jewish people, Israel, is present and future. Israel has a distinctive role and priority in God's kingdom redemptive activity through Jesus the Messiah. By God's design and calling, there's a continuing distinction between Jews and Gentiles in the church today. And fourth, for Jews, distinction takes place fundamentally through Torah obedience as an expression of covenant faithfulness to the God of Israel and the Messiah, Jesus. And so when we read the New Testament, we need to operate on those basic assumptions if we want to read it correctly, where we don't wash Israel out of the story. All right, so that gets us to the Gospel of Matthew finally. Now, before I go on, anybody have any questions or want to add anything?
Very good.
What?
It's very good.
No, I love what you're doing so
Yeah.
far.
Very good.
All right,
Thank you.
sure,
I have a question.
A question about something you said about Gnosticism.
sure.
And I think you said that the church rejected what, theological Gnosticism, but embraced some other form. I just didn't write that down.
Yes, right. So the church long ago, during the early period in church history, rejected theological Gnosticism. This idea that the material world is evil and the spiritual world is good. It rejected that teaching. But what it embraced or held on to is this idea that history is unimportant, that the facts on the ground aren't really that important. And so you could be telling a story about Romeo and Juliet, but you could tell in the center of New York City. And so it's not that important when you're talking about a Broadway play or a Steven Spielberg movie, but it makes a lot of difference when you're reading the Bible, because for the story of the Bible, those details matter because they shape our theology. Okay, yes, Julie, please, what's your question?
Thank you. So I just want, if you would just clarify, R. Kendall Solon, you mentioned that he shared about the three branches of the supersessionism. He's not purporting those, he's just explaining them. Is that
Right,
correct?
he is definitely not supporting those views, correct. He's identifying them.
Exactly.
Yeah, now I should add, he just came out with a new book called, I forgot the name of it, I just blanked.
Oh, he's great. Okay.
But he actually modifies a little bit what he said, but he still does hold to these three distinctions. But he actually points out that we can hold on to this traditional, canonical narrative of creation, fall, redemption, without if we do it by recognizing that the God of that story is Yahweh, the God of Israel. But that's another discussion that we can't get into or we'll never come back from. But he's done an invaluable service because he's really helped us think through how this supersessionism plays out. And if you watch the news, people say, "Oh, I don't hate the Jews," or I don't hate Israel, and but whatever else. Excuse they want to attach to that. In the context of the church, that looks a little bit more like, oh, we don't think God is punishing Jews. Of course not. Anybody can become a Christian. Well, that's noble and generous of them. But what they really mean by that is that Israel as a nation is out. Jews can't come as Jews to God anymore. They've been kicked out of the covenant, so to speak. They can get back in by becoming a part of the church. So there's all kinds of aspects to this discussion that we could spend all day talking about, but we'll never get through the discussion. But I did all that introduction because when we study the Gospel of Matthew, if we don't make those connections, we'll just end up reading it like all these other people read it, all these other New Testament scholars read it. And so that's why it's so important that we become aware of it. Okay, great. Any other questions or comments? Okay. Good. All right, so now then, let's dive into the Gospel of Matthew itself, finally. So I will play my hand right away and tell you what I think the purpose of Matthew's Gospel is. Now, if you go to Bible college or seminary or even go to a Sunday school class and you study the Gospel of Matthew, what will they tell you about the purpose of Matthew? Everyone will say something to the effect of present Jesus as the King of Israel. Isn't that right? Everybody knows that answer, sort of. But that is only like half of the story. If you don't get the whole story, you miss the point. And it's this, that Matthew wrote his gospel to demonstrate and confirm to a Jewish audience that Jesus is the messianic shepherd king. In other words, the Davidic king. He's the messianic shepherd king who's come to inaugurate the eschatological restoration of Israel. Now, I didn't say that he came to complete it initially, but he came to inaugurate it. He will return again, according to the very same gospel, to consummate it, to bring it to its fulfillment. But his initial arrival is to inaugurate the kingdom of Israel's restoration. And that's the whole story in a nutshell. And if you stick with us through these next couple of weeks, we'll unpack that and see what it looks like. Well, so let's talk about the date of Matthew's gospel. Now, when was Matthew written? Let me tell you, this sounds like a simple question, but it makes me pull out my theological hairs. And I don't have as many hairs as I used to these days. It's a little shocking. One day I looked at a picture of myself that somebody took of me from behind, and I discovered I was actually going bald, which is shocking and disturbing. I'm not going to turn around so you can see it, but it's true. When I was a young man, I had a very large Jewish head of hair, but those days are gone. All right, anyway, so traditionally people, well, put it this way, many people will locate Matthew's gospel in the 50s or the 60s. In other words, before the temple's destruction, before the Jewish war that took place. Now, there are a couple of reasons they do that, among others, because there's this anxiety that if they make it any later, that it's questioning whether or not Jesus actually predicted the temple's destruction, or if he's just predicting it sort of after the fact. But I don't think that's a really should be a real concern. Nevertheless, that's a concern that some people have. Most scholars date the Gospel of Matthew in the 80s or the 90s, in the decades following the Jewish war. And this is really important, and I didn't quite make big a deal about it as I should have. It's when all these different Judaisms, because when we think of Judaism, there wasn't one kind of Judaism, there were many, or at least many expressions of Judaism. After the destruction of the temple, it sends such a shock through the nation that they begin to put down their differences, and it coalesces into what some scholars refer to as formative Judaism, meaning that time period from the temple's destruction until what we know as what will eventually become rabbinic Judaism fully formed. So this period when Judaism is coming together, when all these groups that have survived the Roman war begin to consolidate, and you have the development of Jewish texts, all this period is referred to as formative Judaism. So which date I pick sometimes depends on what time of the day you ask me. But I think there's a strong case that can be made for the 80s or the 90s because it so much matches what's going on in the back room of Matthew's gospel. I'll talk about that a little more next time, but we'll discuss that as we go a little bit. Let's talk about Matthew's audience. Now, this seems like it should be a no-brainer question, but nothing's ever easy. For whom was the Gospel of Matthew written? In other words, was Matthew composed of Jews exclusively or Gentiles exclusively? Believe it or not, there are people that say that. Somebody wrote this essay called The Gentile Bias in Matthew's Gospel. And I mean, this thing went on forever. It was written in 1949, and people still read it as this explosive, essay that reveals that Matthew was really writing to Gentiles, which completely turns the story upside down. Or was he writing to Jews and Gentiles together? Now that also has implications. Now it's different from saying that the gospel has relevance to Jews and Gentiles in the context of the New Testament as a collection. But the original audience, who was it? Well, despite attempts to suggest otherwise, I think Matthew's gospel is clearly written for a Jewish audience. And there are a lot of reasons for this. I think Matthew portrays Jesus in three very Jewish ways. One is the new David, secondly is the new Moses, and third as the true teacher of righteousness. By meaning the son of David, it's this idea that he's, again, the messianic shepherd king sent by God to restore the 12 tribe kingdoms of Israel. Now, that doesn't mean that Gentiles weren't there and they weren't taking it in, but primarily this is a Jewish audience picking up on the story. He's also the new Moses. He leads the people of Israel in a new exodus and authoritatively interprets the law of Moses. And then finally, he's the true teacher of righteousness. He reveals the correct way to obey God's commands so that one might enter the kingdom of heaven. Those are very Jewish themes that would resonate with Jewish readers and that were important to them. Secondly, Matthew's use of the Hebrew Bible is very clearly Jewish orientated. The gospel contains 53 formal quotations from the Hebrew Bible, over half of which are not found in any other gospel. And in that 53 quotations, there are about 10 to 14, depending on how you calculate, what we call fulfillment quotations, where Matthew says, this occurred and blah, 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 thus it was fulfilled. And then he quotes an Old Testament prophetic text, and he goes on for length about that. So these are things that a Jewish audience would pick up on as significant. In addition to these formal quotations, the gospel employs numerous allusions, at least 43, probably more, and echoes, which are a little bit less than allusions from the Hebrew Bible, the number of which are difficult to calculate. So together, these things are very distinctive Jewish portraits of Jesus, and they leave little doubt that the gospel is written to a community of Jewish believers in Jesus. All right, so if we argue that Matthew's audience is Jewish, where are they located? Another $10,000 question. There are many theories about the location, the geographic location of Matthew's community, but the best argument can be made for either the city of Antioch in Syria or a city somewhere in the Galilee. Now, there are theological implications based on which city we choose, or which is true, but maybe I just, made a Freudian slip there. The most popular view is Antioch of Syria. Now, there are two Antiochs specifically in the Bible. Anybody know where the other Antioch is? There's Antioch of Syria. What's the other one?
I don't know.
The city in Antioch where Paul gives one of his speeches. But so this isn't that one. This is Antioch of Syria on the Orontes River. And it's considered by most scholars to be this cradle of Jewish Gentile Christianity. The city had a large Jewish and Gentile population, and so sort of matches a lot about what you're reading in the book of Acts. Today it's called, my Turkish isn't very good, Antakya, Turkey, something to that effect. But there are a lot of reasons given for this location. For one, as I said, the city was a center of Christian activity by the late first century. The tone of the gospel suggests that friction existed between the early church community and a nearby group of, quote, formative Jews, this coalescing into
I
Judaism.
don't get that.
I don't get that.
understand
That
what gets-
becomes an
Yeah.
issue behind this story. Then people argue on the basis of textual evidence that the text seems to support this view of Antioch. Namely, this reference to Galilee of the Gentiles, although that's not what Galilee of the Gentiles means, and we'll see that next time we talk. Antioch was multilingual, so that would account for the Greek. And Ignatius of Antioch, an early church father who died around 110, cites Matthew in his gospel, so the argument goes it must have been written nearby. And there's a lot of strong arguments made for Antioch. The other view, however, is that it was written somewhere in Galilee. Zippori, or Sepphoris, as it was sort of old-fashionedly called, is probably the main candidate, but there are others, Capernaum and Tiberias, these large cities in the Galilee. Now, I'm going to pretend this isn't really making me fixate, because it was really making me fixate when I was thinking about it. And there's a lot of debate about whether it is in the Galilee. I think it was, but I want to delay on some of those discussions so a little bit later on in our study. But I do want to say this. Critics of the Galilean hypothesis contend that the existence of Jewish believers in the Galilee in the first 3 centuries cannot be confirmed with any certainty. In other words, yeah, there's some little hints that there may have been Jewish believers in the Galilee at this time, but not much, the argument goes. And some of the rabbinic texts talk about the apostates, which is assumed to be a reference to the Jewish believers. But again, people argue that's pretty thin. I think the evidence is stronger than they suggest. Now, we do know that there were clearly no Gentile Christians present in Galilee until the 4th century. We know that because it wasn't until then that they began building the first churches around the Sea of Galilee. In fact, one of the first churches built there was built by a Jewish convert to Christianity who got permission from Constantine to build a church. But that said, I think Peter's house in Capernaum challenges the claim that there's no evidence of Jewish believers in the Galilee early on during these first 3 centuries. How have many of you been to Jerusalem, been to Israel for a visit?
Yes.
Okay, good. Did you get to visit Peter's house in Galilee? Okay.
Yes.
It is pretty intense to see that. It's if you think this is really the house where Peter lived and Jesus took up residence. Oh, there's so much I could say. I was getting lost in my thoughts there for a minute. But the point is, while many critics dismiss the relevance of this archaeological site, the evidence suggests that the Jewish believers in Jesus venerated. Now, venerated doesn't mean worship. It means they gave great respect and honor to the house during this time period. Does anybody know what that evidence is? I'm just curious. Why do we say that? What evidence is there that this house was something special? Anybody know?
No.
I'll show you in a second. I'll tell you in a second rather than. But now this is, as you all know that have been there, the church that is built on top of Peter's house. And, you know, it's just, I'm going to, because I'm taping this, I will not say anything negative, but it's a lot of chutzpah to build a church on top of an archaeological site. I'll just say that. Anyway, and from above, it looks like the Millennial Falcon. Did anybody ever notice that before? It is absolutely true. This is where Han Solo parked. It is definitely the Millennial Falcon. Anyway, below this large monstrosity, and I didn't say that out loud, is that what's supposed to be the house of Peter. And this is what we see. Now, can you see the octagon? You can see the octagon. It's really hard to see it. You have to, if you are in the building, there's a glass floor, of course, and you can look down. It's still hard to see. Or you can go outside and you can look underneath, but it's very difficult to look at. But, excuse me, but there it is. But you see these octagons, and when you're there, nobody wants to admit that they can't really tell what it is, right? When you were there, could you really tell what you were looking at?
No.
Yeah, okay.
No.
Don't confess. But it is hard to make out. Now, this is what it looked like before they built the Millennial Falcon on top of it. So you see the octagons, and then you see so there are 3 layers of octagons, and then the thing in the center. In the center, below that, is the original house that was believed to be the house of Jesus, or Yeshua, as his mother called him. Now, here is a picture, and I'll explain more in a minute. So here you can see it's an old picture that I guess was sort of painted a little bit, but it's so hard to get a look at what was there before they started building and recreating stuff on it. But can you see my arrow? Is that moving for you?
Yeah.
So here's the octagon, obviously. In the center is where the house of Peter believed to be the room where Jesus lived. And then in the middle, we have what's called an insula, which is a technical term referring to this housing area and low walls. And then over here, you have the remains of a synagogue and a courtyard here. The synagogue, of course, looks nothing like this today because they built it up. But it was a 4th century synagogue. Below it, of course, is the 1st century synagogue, or we believe it is, but we'll talk about that later. So where was the room of Jesus? Well, you can see it by looking at this. So you can you see the octagon? Do you recognize it? And you can see these gray lines. These are the original rooms of the insula or buildings that extended into this part of the courtyard. And in the center, is the house or the room of Jesus. Now, there was a little, this little room that was venerated. Why? Here's why we say it's quote unquote the house of Jesus or the house of Peter where Jesus lived, is because this 1st century house, in terms of archaeology, there's layers of debris of cookware from the 1st century, in the early part of the 1st century. But sometime in the later part of the 1st century, it changes. It goes from being, pots and pans or whatever to little lamps and jars of what would have been wine, or containers to hold wine, and little lamps. So in other words, it goes from being a traditional house to a place where we find lamps, containers of wine, all these little things that are connected with worship. Also, this room was kept pristine and clean. It was painted apparently over and over. And between the layers of paint, it is completely clean. All these are indicators that this room was kept spotless and that it had sort of a religious and spiritual significance. So this is the reason why scholars believe that this was the house of St. Peter, that from the very earliest time was treated with great respect and awe as the location where Jesus stayed. And so, in other words, this becomes a place in the first century of a house of worship for these Jewish believers, where they gathered. And so people refer to this as perhaps the very first house church. Now, there are a lot of critics to that view. Now, but to explain a little bit further, so first you have this room that was coated in plaster. Then around the 4th century, you can see the dark blue walls. They built it up and made it into a bigger church, and then they built later in the 5th century this octagon structure. And in the Byzantine church period, they would take special places and build these octagon shrines around them, these octagon churches. And so that's why the octagon is there. Now, all this was destroyed in the 7th century when the Persians swept into Israel and destroyed everything. Now, at the time, the Persians were not Islamic even. They were just out and out pagans,
Yeah, right.
destroying
Yeah.
everything.
Much later. It's later. Much later. It's on our side of the cross.
Yeah.
That's the
Yeah,
7th century.
so it's pretty, anyway, it's a fascinating sight to see all that. So all that to say, it's hard being theological and shifting to archaeological at the same time. I get pulled in many different directions. But the point is that there's evidence of what may have been the very first place of worship for Jewish believers in the 1st or 2nd century. At least that's part of the argument. All right, so any questions about that?
No.
No.
I had
Okay.
one question.
Sure.
You're talking about people in the Galil that were Jewish believers in a certain date, but where do you put the Evyonim in? Weren't they in that same area, or were they not?
Yeah, I'm not sure exactly where they were, to be honest with you. I'll double check. But the history gets complicated at that point. So instead of blowing smoke, I'll just say I will check on that because it's a good question. I'm not up on that, to be honest, but I'll check.
I'm confused.
Me too.
About what?
I'm confused as to understand the idea of any Gentile being a Christian at that particular time that we're reading about in Matthew, when obviously the message has come to the nation of Israel that the Messiah that they've been seeking has come, and they've been told that through to repent and be baptized, so they would have be in right standing with God after 400 years of silence. So I don't understand any dialogue regarding any Gentiles who would have any understanding of their need for a savior when they were all idol worshippers anyway. So I'm
Okay.
kind of confused.
All right. Okay, that's a good. All right, good. Thank you. So I was flying a little bit to try to get through, but this is a good point to back up a little bit. So you have the story in the gospel. Now, no one would argue there that it's involving the original audience. Well, no, I take that back. There are those who believe that Matthew was written as a gospel. There are some to Gentiles, not to Jews, and that it may be recording the story of what Jesus' interaction with Jews, but it wasn't written to them. There are some people that believe that. I don't think it's not the most popular view anymore, but there are some well-known scholars that still subscribe to that view. Now, in the early, first 3 centuries, eventually Galilee is depopulated of Jews, obviously, due to the exiles. They weren't all removed or all taken into exile, but many are gone. So then you have these, then the argument goes, then you have Gentiles in the region who are here. And then Certainly, you have Christians coming from all over the world once it becomes the official state religion of the Roman Empire. And then you have the Byzantine Church building churches in the Holy Land. And so, and of course, what's the difference between what's the difference between the Roman Empire and the Byzantine Empire? Does anybody know?
No.
The difference is that they're both the quote unquote, the Roman Empire, but the Byzantine Empire is with Christianity. So it's supposed to be the Roman Empire, but without the Roman gods and with the Christian God. So that's what makes it the Byzantine Empire. Anyway, that's the whole story behind Peter's house and this whole debate. But the point is that here you have this example of a place that very well may have been held in great regard by these early Jewish believers. Now, very quickly, obviously, it is taken over by non-Jews and used as a house of worship. Anyway, so we'll go on from there. All right, so now that was the easy part of this discussion. The hard part is when we talk about what we call the social location of Matthew's community. Anybody recognize this spot?
What, you don't know?
That's
No.
Magdala.
That's correct. This is Magdala, which is a absolute real thing first century synagogue, which, believe it or not, there are surprisingly not that many that we can find in Israel. They've discovered more and more, but they're hard to come by. This is a treasure, and I could talk about it all by itself. But this is what, you see all these pictures of of Jesus teaching in the synagogue or whatnot. I even get pulled into it when I'm going to illustrate something, and you see Jesus in these giant synagogues, looking like he's speaking in a Spanish synagogue someplace in medieval Europe. But they didn't look anything like that. They looked like this, square, with seats going around the room. All right, so and before we begin, a caveat. By the way, I know that I wanted to mention, I know that a lot of new people have come in. I think my sister and her husband are in here. Are they in here? Are you guys here?
Yes.
Hey, Dad. Yo. All right. All right. All right. That was a personal plug. So anyway, we're going back. All right. Hi, guys. We'll talk later. All right. So let's talk about the social location of Matthew's community. I know we're running short on time, but I'll get through what I can, and we'll finish this up next time. But I want to begin with a caveat. And it's this. Matthew scholars are do this a lot. Matthew scholars have produced a seemingly unending supply of books and essays about the social location of Matthew's community, enough to fill the world's oceans. I exaggerate only slightly. Asking questions about the historical context of Matthew's gospel, however, does not necessarily guarantee accurate theological conclusions. Do you know what I mean by that? A lot of people think that if we study the Bible, we study the history, we study the Jewish background, that we walk away with good theology as a result because we understand the Jewish backgrounds. That is not true, and I'll show you why. Historically, Christians have taken it for granted that the Gospel of Matthew is a Christian, meaning not Jewish text. Now, that doesn't mean they don't think it's Jewish feeling. They just mean it belongs to Christianity, not to Judaism. Now, this is true of modern Christian scholars as well, who make an important historical and theological distinction, meaning this. Scholars agree that Matthew's gospel and the context in which it was created should be understood against the historical background of Second Temple Judaism. In other words, we read the Bible sort of through three pictures or three ways. One is like we're looking at the Bible through a window. We look at the Bible and we want to get to the historical Jesus. So the Bible's like a window that we're looking through, and we want to get all the historical details, like this question about where was he, where did he do this and where did he do that, and can we find this? So, and where was the actual community that this took place in? So for some, the Bible's like a window. Another way we read the Bible is though it's a painting. The Gospels each paint a picture of Jesus. They include some things, they leave some things out of the story because they're painting a picture of Jesus. So we have to be aware of that. The third way, when we look at the Gospels, is that it's a mirror. In other words, it's a mirror in which the original audience was interpreting what Jesus or what the writers had to say. So sometimes we're asking questions about the historical Jesus. Sometimes we're asking questions about the portrait that the Gospels paint. And sometimes we're asking questions about the community that received it, and we use it as sort of a mirror to understand that community. So in other words, what these scholars say is that, yeah, we need to think about Jewish backgrounds when we're thinking about Jesus and when we're thinking about the original community. All those things are important. But here's what I want you to notice. It's the background of Second Temple Judaism. In other words, it's a little bit of that window dressing. It is not the main story. That's important. So it's important on a historical level. However, on a theological level, Second Temple Judaism is inconsequential, plays no role in shaping the church's identity, doctrine, or practice. Now, I'm not saying that Christians should go out and buy a copy of the Book of Jubilees tomorrow and start reading it to learn how they should behave. It's not what I'm saying. But I'm saying it doesn't have any sort of real connection when understanding itself beyond the fact that it explains things. It doesn't have that kind of authoritative impact in reading the text. I'll try to show you what I mean. So all this brings us to the question of whether Matthew's community was or was not a part of Judaism. Questions about the social context of Matthew's community have traditionally been framed in terms of the intramuros versus the extramuros debate, meaning intramuros meaning literally within the walls, within Judaism, versus the extramuros debate, or was it outside the walls of Judaism? In other words, is Matthew's community inside or outside the walls, the boundaries of Judaism? Now, let me tell you, I, at one point in my life, got really hot in this discussion, and it took me nowhere, and I'll show you why. So the intramuros view argues that Matthew wrote to a community of Jewish believers that were still a part of Judaism. Like, yeah, they're still in there. They're real Jews. They were engaged in this intramuros debate with Judaism, trying to persuade their fellow co-religionists that Jesus is the Messiah. That sounds great. Now, I like that view, or I did like that view. Then there's the extramuros view. This view holds that Matthew wrote to a community of Jews and some Gentiles who have, quote, parted company with Judaism. They were thus engaged in extramuros debate. Although they were no longer a part of Judaism, Although they were no longer a part of Judaism, Matthew's community continued in an apologetic dialogue with the synagogue in hopes, quote, that individual Jews would be converted. Now, this is where we get this argument that, of course, Jews can be saved. They just need to join the church as individuals, not as a nation. Well, that is a red herring, if you know what I mean. What's really going on? What's the real question? Even if Matthew's community is a part of Judaism, they're on the way out from this perspective. More importantly, Matthew's community is actually, quote, the church, which replaces Israel as the new people of God. The question is not really about Israel or about Judaism, but rather about whether or not the church was formed inside or outside of the shell of Judaism. Do you see what I mean? This is where most scholars get into this debate. And I have to tell you, I spent hours reading these guys, and then I began to realize that even the ones that argue that he was inside of Judaism were saying that, yeah, eventually we end up with the church and all this stuff falls away. So it's kind of a red herring when people get into this discussion. So, any questions about that? Okay. Are you following me? I don't want to leave anybody behind. Okay, all that to say, this approach, I think, has taken the church down a bad path. If you add all that stuff we talked about in the beginning about supersessionism and all this approach to the text, this is why we're at today. So in recent years, there's been a growing development of what scholars have come to refer to as an approach called Matthew within Judaism. And this is where we're going to go in this study. What do we mean by Matthew within Judaism? Anders Runiusson writes, and by the way, he's a great scholar. If you get a chance to read him, he's brilliant. I don't think English is his first language, but his English is better than mine. So Matthew's narrative and the context in which it was produced is not, quote, something to be understood against the background of Second Temple Judaism, but rather as an expression of it. Do you understand what I mean? Do you see the difference? Not just background, but as actually Second Temple Judaism. And so now what are there when we talk about these Judaism? Some scholars argue that we need to say Judaisms because at the time of Jesus, there were these many different kinds of Judaisms. Others say, well, no, there was really a core Judaism that all these different groups would agree on, and they have their different distinctions. But in any event, we can identify these groups, Pharisaic Judaism, Essenes or Qumranic Judaism, Enochic Judaism, which we would sort of pick out from the book of First Enoch. And then there's the undiscovered Judaism we don't even know about. And what we'd say is that within this group of Judaism is Matthean Judaism. Now, let me be very clear. From Matthew's perspective, certainly from Jesus's perspective, this is the only legitimate expression of Judaism. Meaning you have to follow Jesus's interpretation of the Torah or you're out. You're out of the kingdom. That's the whole point. But if we don't understand the framework in which all this is unfolding, we're missing the story. Okay, so Matthew's gospel, in other words, is a Jewish text, meaning not a, quote, Christian text. Did anybody ever see the movie, this is an aside, Hannah and Her Sisters? This is before Mia Farrow hated Woody Allen. But in that movie, this is like dating myself. Woody Allen is having a crisis of faith and he's experimenting with different religions, and he decides to become a Catholic, and he goes to the grocery store and buys a loaf of white bread and mayonnaise. See, that's funny if you have a Jewish background, because in America you eat rye bread and mustard. Anyway, bad, terrible joke. Anyway, it's a Jewish text, meaning it is in Jewish space. Matthew's gospel is a Jewish text which presents Jesus as the authoritative interpreter of the Torah, whose halakha, and halakha means literally way to walk, referring to his interpretation of the Torah. There are many different halakhic interpretations of the Torah, Pharisaic, Qumranic, but his is the one that is authoritative, that must be obeyed in order to enter the kingdom of heaven. That's the heart of Matthew's gospel. Matthew's community is a Torah observant community that is broken away from and rejected its parent community, the Pharisees. Now, I realize I may have thrown that in there a little randomly, but if you read Matthew 23, Jesus is just excoriating the Pharisees. In Matthew's gospel, well, let me ask you a question. Why, when we see pictures of the Pharisees, well, I'll change that. When you see pictures of Pharisees in movies or whatnot, what color are their clothes?
Black.
Do you agree? They're always black, right? In Israel, I don't get to what the chosen very easily, but how do they dress in that movie? They're dressed in black too, right? Right? They're always in black. You know, who wears black? The bad guys, right? Always. Why are they bad guys? Because in Matthew's gospel, they're always bad guys. They are never the good guys. Now, in the New Testament, are Pharisees always the bad guys?
No.
No, right. They're not. Why? Because in Acts, we find out there are a lot of them that become believers in Yeshua, believers in Jesus. Paul not brags. He's proud of his Pharisaic heritage. So it's clearly not a bad thing. In Matthew, they are always evil. And so Matthew is openly hostile. And this is why it seems to match up in terms of Matthew's community, that it's a community that is broken away from the Pharisaic mother community. This gets very psychological. You know, you have this love-hate relationship with your family. Who are the ones that you love, but who do you hate most? Your family, right? So that's the idea. And so this is why Jesus in Matthew is so hostile to the Pharisees, is because they represent the community that this group has more than likely broken away from, or at least that's the most coherent way of looking at it. By the way, this is supposed to be a Jewish discussion, which means you can engage in heated debate with me about it if you disagree. All right, so question? Okay, so Matthew's community, in other words, practices a form of Judaism, which we can therefore call Matthean Judaism, which is really a subset of apostolic Judaism, because you have Paul's version of Judaism and Peter's version of Judaism. So it fits into this subset. There were many expressions of Second Temple Judaism or Judaisms, but from Matthew's perspective, a Messiah, Yeshua-centered Judaism is the only legitimate form of Judaism. And so, you know, people make jokes about Bible Belt Christians who say, "Are you saved, brother?" You know, people like to make fun of people who make those kind of statements as though it doesn't come up in the Bible or in the Gospels. Well, how do you ask that question in Jewish language about are you saved? Well, the way you ask those kind of questions were, whose interpretation of the Torah do you follow? If you're not following Jesus' interpretation of the Torah, you are on the outside. You are not in the community of the elect. You are not saved. That's how it works. You will not inherit the kingdom of heaven. That's the idea. All right. So anyway, so I've given you, just to layer on some more of this, some examples of Jewish practice in Matthew's gospel that I lifted this from an essay by Runison. You know, there's examples of prayer, almsgiving, fasting. And sometimes there are negative observations in here, but the point is you still see them taking place in a Jewish framework. Keeping the Jewish law, that included dietary laws, purity laws, keeping the Sabbath. People, have you ever heard people say, Jesus reiterated all the 10 commandments except the Sabbath?
Yes, I've heard that.
Yeah, completely not true. The Sabbath gets a whole chapter in Matthew, chapter 12, about the Sabbath, the right way to keep the Sabbath. That's just not true. Festivals, the Passover. I get very upset when John or Luke does a better job of talking about Jewish stuff than Matthew, but sometimes they do. John covers more festivals than Matthew, but whatever, I can live with it. But there are festivals, tithing. Jesus says, what? You tithe mint and dill and cumin, and you should have done these things without failing to do the greater commandments. Justice, love, and mercy. Where in the Bible does it say to tithe mint and dill and cumin?
In the law?
It doesn't say it anywhere, actually. It's rabbinic, or
Oh.
it's
Okay.
midrashic stipulations about these regulations about what you should do. So here you have an example of Jesus saying you should obey the teachings of the religious leaders of Israel. The temple cult, and I use that word in a technical sense, meaning a system of religious work. Most likely circumcision. Look, Jews don't have to talk about it. You just know you're supposed to do it. And then finally, public ritual reading of the Torah in the synagogue settings. Again, you see that clearly in Luke, but it's in there. I'm sure Matthew does it too. Anyway, so those are examples just of Jewish practice. But it's not enough that we think about Matthew in that way. We need to realize that in Matthew, there is a cosmic apocalyptic struggle going on. There is for Matthew's, so it's in on the narrative level, but it's also on the level of the community that's receiving the text. Matthew's community is engaged in a cosmic struggle between the sons of the kingdom and the sons of the evil one. Matthew chapter 13, verse 38. Now, I realize this picture's over the top. It's a little dramatic, but there is a demonic struggle, I think, going on, but it's not really in that particular text. But anyway, it makes the point. Also, in Matthew's gospel, there is this struggle between the realm of Satan. The earth is a realm under the sway of the devil. It is, in this story, the kingdom of heaven versus the kingdom of Satan. I love this sign. I don't know what state it's in, but Satan's kingdom. You really want to go with that for your state park? Anyway, but it is a big theme in Matthew's gospel, the kingdom of heaven, the kingdom of heaven. How many times have you been told or read that the kingdom of heaven is a circumlocution for the kingdom of God, a way of not saying kingdom of God because it's Jewish? The only problem with that idea is that it does say the kingdom of God in Matthew's gospel. He does say it. So it means actually something a little different. The kingdom of heaven is what Jesus is actualizing, bringing down to earth, specifically bringing down to the land of Israel and wiping out the land that Satan has dominion over. Anyway, we'll get deeper into that, but just to whet your appetite, that's what's going on here in the story. And then, but along that line, you see, this is right out of the theology of Second Temple Judaism, this very dualistic soteriology. And what we mean by dualistic soteriology is from what? Soterios, meaning salvation. The idea is that there's two extremes, the saved and the unsaved, the elect and the non-elect. And we see this a lot in Matthew. You have a division of the world of Israel into the categories of the righteous and the doers of lawlessness, the righteous and the wicked, the righteous and the cursed, the wise and the foolish, the faithful and the wise versus the wicked, the good versus the wicked. Those are all examples of how Matthew breaks up the world of Israel into these categories of those who follow the Messiah and those who don't.